Welcome to the District Plan Review update, and I'm going to start by admitting that it's not entirely an update that is the focus of the session, but more of a sort of a run-through about what the District Plan involves, because we are entering a bit of a new phase, being the hearings, and the hearings come with a whole lot of scrutiny and interest and just general work, essentially, that's involved in running through, is it 255 submitters?
Yep, and
87 further submitters, of which roughly half of those wish to be heard. So it's those people that wish to be heard which is the focus. And obviously, as you've heard previously, we have been forming a panel to actually hear those submissions. So we've really...
Sorry to interrupt, but just because we're live streaming as well, can we just do a quick whip around and just introduce everyone in the room so anyone watching knows who's here?
Sure. So my name's Hamish Burrell, District Planning Manager.
Megan Gunn, Team Leader Policy in the Planning Unit.
I'm Michael Garbutt, Solicitor from Anderson Lloyd.
Kia ora koutou, Louise Taylor, Planner assisting the planning team.
Good afternoon, Scott Shannon, Councillor.
Afternoon, everyone. Michelle Pye, Councillor.
Afternoon, Nigel Mayor.
Good afternoon, everyone. Nigel Davenport, CE Venture Timaru.
Good afternoon, Sally Parker, Councillor.
Kia ora, Owen Jackson, Councillor.
Stacey Scott, Councillor.
Thank you. I'll just hand it over to the presenters for this afternoon. So that is Michael Garbutt, and obviously he's no stranger to TDC, and he's been involved in many of these sort of hearing processes, and also Louise Taylor, who is a experienced RM Hearings Commissioner, done a lot of work in Dunedin and elsewhere, and she's been helping provide guidance to the team in terms of what we need and helping us prepare for the hearings, which are coming up as soon as end of November. So without further ado, I will hand over and let them run through the presentation. Thank you.
Great, thanks Hamish, and thanks everyone, thanks for having us. We're really enjoying getting involved with the team and helping get everything underway and heading forward into the hearings, which is pretty exciting time for the district plan. So today we wanted to cover a number of matters. I'll go through another slide running in a bit more detail, but there's some key considerations for council as a whole that really need to be front of mind as you're going forward into your plan, proposed district plan hearings process. Megan's going to provide you with an update of the hearing schedule. As you can imagine, with the number of submissions you've got, it's not tenable to just run it submitter by submitter. So what councils commonly do is they split the hearings up into topics, and so we've done that. We wanted to talk a little bit about councillors' roles, or roles, depending on where they sit through that hearings process. Touch a little bit on variations to the district plan, and at the end we've just got a slide on what some implications may be if we end up with a change of government post-election. So really, key things are update you on the hearing schedule, talk through the key matters of focus over the next 12 to 18 months, what are the key risks and key challenges, talk through your roles during the hearing and variation process, what it is, what it isn't, and look at that issue of potential conflicts of interest, look at district plan variations if council decides to proceed with any, the complexity around that, how that adds to the complexity of the district plan review process, potential timing, and the fact that they do need to be based on an evidential basis, and as I mentioned, some potential implications if we do have a change of government. So, and by the way, just really happy to take any questions as we go, so just jump on in. So hearings, particularly district plan hearings, they're really resource hungry. They're an intense period of activity for a long period of time for council staff. They do cost a lot of money. They do require a lot of specialist input. and they are public facing. So that means there's often a high degree of interest from media and key stakeholders over a long period of time. So that obviously requires resource to manage that, and it can be intense on staff. It is really important that the hearing is independent, it's fair and efficient in terms of how it's run. So Hamish mentioned before about the hearings panel. It's really important that that panel is seen to be independent so that it can make an independent decisions. In terms of submitters, some can feel outside their comfort zones. For some people coming along to present their submissions to a hearings panel, it might be the first time that they've gotten involved in any process like this, and it can be stressful situation, and for them they may feel the consequences are really important and really high in terms of which way it goes and how it might affect their business or their livelihood or their amenity of their properties. So it's high stakes for people. And that can mean that the hearings can be a stressful, high stakes environment, and you may get people as councillors talking to you and trying to influence how that might go. So really important that you've got quality resources and really good processes. That's a good investment. It will mean that you will save a whole lot of money and time and litigious risk in the end. So yeah, that's the key of that one. Is there any queries on those points? Cool. So in terms of resourcing requirements, you've obviously got Hamish and Megan who are doing a sterling job, but are a bit light on resource at the moment, and my observation is that there's probably a bit more resource that you will need as a council. Some project management assistance will be necessary to get you through what is a really intense, busy time with lots of interacting requirements. Hearing administrator, who I understand you have appointed, and should be starting shortly if she hasn't already, so that's great. And then another role that you will need is a panel advisor. So that's a qualified planner who will assist with that conduit between the council staff, submitters, but more importantly to the panel and advising the panel who will be making the decisions to assist them to make sure you get really good quality decisions. So in terms of the district plan going forward, it's our view that it really needs to be a key priority for council. To get this done at all, but to do it well, is going to take, as I said, some significant staffing. It does need significant budget. It does need priority in terms of just the little things, making venues available, making sure you've got meeting times available, and that staff are able to be freed up to do those tasks. In terms of council, all departments in some respects are affected by the district plan, and they really do need to work together. So at the moment we do have a situation where you've got some submission from internal staff on the current notified plan. The ideal would be that those submissions are resolved prior to the hearing, because it's not a great look to be dealing with those in a public forum. So we are really trying to work those through prior to the hearing if they can.
Just if I can add to that too, I mean, that's a critical point for council reputationally and in terms of running a good process, having different arms of council with different positions on the district plan is a really challenging situation to be in, because then you're expecting the panel to resolve that in a public way, and we really do think that it's, as we've said, good practice and an important focus for the senior management team to work on resolving that position internally before you go to a public hearing, because council should be able to say, well, this is the most appropriate outcome for a particular part of the plan that, you know, meets all council requirements. We think is a critical thing, rather than throwing it sort of effectively an internal dispute to a hearing panel to resolve for you, which doesn't seem to us to be good practice. So we've encouraged the senior management team to work on that for that reason. Yep.
It's a little hard to read, apologies. But yeah, this is our hearing schedule, and as you can see, we've split it up into topics. And Megan, do you want to take the councillors through that?
Yep, so the hearings, we have designed them into 9 different hearings. So starting from the high level and the general matters, that's been scheduled in November, December time. So we're working towards that date. And the second hearing will be for the zone provisions and providing the frameworks for the different zones. The next one will be the nature environment and hazard and risks. So each of those topics will involve quite a number of different chapters from the district plan, because we have a total of some 56 chapters with rules and provisions, and also other chapters which actually contain some general matters and stuff like that. So each of those hearings will be pretty much really intense. The next one will be for the cultural values. That's including the Sesam's chapter and also the Maori Purpose Zone and historical heritage. The next one is the infrastructure, subdivision, and any growth. So we'll consider to place the growth matters in that way, which allows the officers and expertise to have enough time to actually going through the evidence, whatever is provided, and to make full assessments on what's being requested. Also, the next one would be some other district-wide matters, such as what we call them smaller chapters, like noise, temporary activities, or relocated buildings. That sort of chapters will be captured in there. We're also scheduled into 2 variations. They were primarily designed to accommodate the variations the council are committed to do. So those ones were including the future development areas we have put in a priority as 2 years period. So we know to enable those priority areas to be released, we need to get the development area plan ready, and for the time being, it probably will be checking at around February 2025 time. So that's some of the priority future development areas we have scheduled in the proposed plan. Another one is more a placeholder there, just in case if there's any immediate national direction saying you have to implement certain changes right away. And if time doesn't allow, that's actually have happened to many of the Tier 1 councils around Christchurch and Auckland, so they had to do their variation to implement some national directions. So that's where the placeholders were placed up. And the last one would just be a sweep up for any loose ends and any things we think we should be dealing with which haven't been covered in the earlier hearings. So that's how they were designed. And time-wise, the last hearing, if all 9 is going ahead, will be finished by June 2025, June, July-ish. Following that, that's the panel to draft up the decisions and release these decisions. They'll take a few months later to wrap everything up.
So oh, sorry, any question? I was just going to add to that. So just in summary, you've got 6 topics to cover the district plan that's been notified now. So at the moment, you've got a notified district plan, you've got a number of submissions and further submissions. The panel will be appointed to consider those submissions on what's been notified, and we've got that split into 6 topics. So all going well, you should have all of that through by November next year, which would be a really great outcome. You have a line in the sand, you can get your decisions out, and you'll have your proposed plan, you'll have your decisions version of that, and you can see if you have any appeals. The variations are dealt with separately because, of course, they haven't been notified yet, so they would need a whole separate. Does that sort of make sense? Cool.
All right, so I can talk to you about the hearing panel and its role and responsibility. So the panel is appointed to make decisions and all procedural decisions in relation to the submissions. That's a crucial role, obviously. The panel is currently appointed with an independent chair, and I understand there'll be a planning specialist and at least 1 councillor on that. And I think Hamish is bringing a paper back to council about the composition of that next week, so you'll relook at that. The role is, as you've heard, quite an onerous one for those decision makers. They've got a lot of submissions to wrestle with. They need to be, and to be, appear to be, but most of all be, free of potential conflicts of interest, and effectively sit separately from their role as council, and their role, as we've set up there, is to consider submitters' evidence. The 42A report, which is basically the staff reports that come to council to make recommendations about what the panel should do in that officer's mind about the changes to the plan, and they need to apply the Resource Management Act and any other statutory criteria such as national policy statements, regional policies, and settle on the relevant objectives, policies and rules and zonings for your plan. So it's important to be aware of that independence and the role of the panel to make decisions based on the evidence in light of the statutory criteria and then make written decisions. And those decisions are all appealable on their merits to the Environment Court. So decisions need to be well reasoned and focus only on the relevant issues and applying the relevant criteria. It's quite a different role from your normal council voting around the table on a particular policy issue where you each get a vote and you make your decision about what you think the best thing is to do. This is much more like being a judge in a court and focusing only on the evidence and not taking into account extraneous matters such as people politicking or people coming to the panel members and attempting to influence them outside the process. So there are rules around that, and one of the obvious rules that the panel will issue when they make their initial directions is things like communication with the panel must be in writing via the hearing administrator, and that will go on the website and be available to all submitters so that communications to and from the panel are transparent and everyone has equal opportunity and equal access to the panel. So that's an important legal point that you all understand, so that we would ask as legal advisors to the council that you do respect that, because if there is a perception amongst any submitters that people are having access to the panel outside the process, that creates procedural risk, and people could have a crack and challenge the council's process if that were perceived to be occurring. So that's a really important, I suppose, rules of the road in terms of going into a formal RMA hearing process. At the end of all that, following appeals, the district plan comes back to the full council for ratification and approval to adopt it as the final document. But that is a final step following all decisions and all appeals being resolved. So that's quite a wee way down the track. So the commissioners and councillors on the hearing panel need to be free from actual and potential conflicts of interest, as I've said. Need to be an accredited decision maker under the RMA. Avoid discussing issues, and I've put sort of beyond the panel or outside the statutory process, and the work of the panels are effectively confidential to the panel members until they issue their written decisions with their reasons. They need to come, obviously, to consider all submissions with an open mind, and decisions are made on the evidence that's presented to the panel. For those councillors who are not on the panel, our guidance to you would be that you can continue thinking about plan development and potential variations that staff have talked about and may come to council to promote a variation potentially in the future. But we think it's unwise to speak publicly about the current provisions or the hearing process or talking about that. You've effectively delegated to the panel the responsibility to hear all those submissions in that framework, and to be contributing in the media or on the sidelines probably is unhelpful to that process, because the panel, as I've explained already, are really obliged to put that to one side and say, I'm not influenced by that, but it creates a perception that they might be, which we would rather avoid. So that's an important thing just to keep in mind. Councillors, if you have submitted, can pursue a personal submission. I think one of the councillors has. That's their personal role, and they can be an advocate for their own personal interests, but we would expect that they have no participation in the hearing panel if they choose to pursue a personal interest. And I've just said there they should do that with care in terms of they've got two hats there, a personal interest and effectively a governor of the organisation, and they would still want to see that the district plan process proceeds effectively and smoothly, but you know, they might obviously pursue their own personal interest. A little bit of discussion about variations. I know the council has asked staff to investigate one variation currently, which is on the work programme. So the current hearing process will consider the current submissions and further submissions that have already been filed, as Louise has said. Some submissions may well be out of scope of the district plan, and an example might be people sometimes seek funding for projects which is normally the old annual plan or long-term plan issue. They can't be dealt with by the hearing panel. So the panel will potentially need to make decisions that certain issues that have been raised by submissions might be outside the scope of what the panel can do in terms of the RMA decisions. And we do note that as you've seen with that work program and the number of submissions and the number of hearings, there's a heavy work program for staff to get through those by late next year. Variations that come along do add complexity, additional cost, and probably divert that resource. Variations will need to be sort of advocated if they stack up on an evidential basis. So it's just something to keep in mind. So really, from my perspective, quite externally from the council, I think it's an important position as governors of the organisation that you do support the staff to get on and run a good hearing process and let them run that with the panel because it is a difficult and onerous task over the next several months.
Just before you move on,
Yep.
Mike, just to add to that, in terms of the variations versus, there are some submitters that have sought changes to zoning to enable growth in the district. Now, those submissions will be considered as part of the schedule of the hearings. There are submissions on your currently notified proposed district plan, so they will be considered as part of this process. What the panel will be doing, though, for those what we call upzoning or growth submissions, is that those submitters will be asked to provide additional information and evidence quite some time before the hearing to justify, so to assist the panel to make a decision about whether to accept that request or not. So that will be usually things like perhaps effects assessments under Section 32 of the RMA, which is the cost-benefit analysis, maybe an assessment on how the proposal might affect other parts of the district in terms of demand and supply and those things, infrastructure, those things. So just so you're aware that there will be a minute that comes out from the panel asking for the submitters that have sought upzonings to provide that information well in advance of that particular hearing so that staff have an opportunity to review that and provide their own recommendation and to make sure that the panel has enough information to be able to make a decision on that. So that's scheduled in the hearing. That's part of our hearing schedule. But what we're talking about here is any other proposals that are not included in the district plan at the moment that council may wish to pursue in terms of variations to the district plan. And as Mike said, they in themselves add quite a bit of complexity and cost and time and must go through the statutory requirements as they go through before they're proposed. And then at that stage, they would have their own submissions and hearings and so on.
A question on that. So a variation as such could put the process at risk around, I assume, legal challenge through the likes of the Environment Court. So would have to be careful around any variations that are considered if they're then going to be appealed through the Environment Court, that actually can put the entire plan at risk as far as being signed off. Is that correct?
I can talk to that. I'm hesitating because it's probably a yes and no answer in the sense that a variation can occur at any time, but it's a question of what you're varying and what stage that's at that present time. So at the moment, you've got a whole district plan out there for submission. Decisions haven't been made, and if you vary it now, let's say you vary part of, let's say, the residential zone, then you've got new submissions coming in on a varied part, overlaying existing submissions. So it becomes very complicated for people out there to understand what's the current state of play, and it does become complicated. So I suppose what I'm thinking is you've got a heavy work program of current provisions notified with submissions. You've got to get through and make decisions on those. If you're starting to add in variations along the way, it adds high degrees of complexity and adding layers of submissions on top of others. That's probably the rule of thumb. Yeah.
And I guess to finish that off, an alternate to that is then waiting for the process to run its full course, and then you've got the opportunity, as you always do at any time, as plan change.
To do a plan change, yeah, that's right. And that's the difference in language. Once the plan is going through the submission process, you can vary it. Once it's completed, then you can change it at any time in the future. Yep.
And just to add to that, what may be the best course of action is to go through your current submissions that you've got, run through your hearings, then, and as the schedule, as we have it, you should be able to do that by November next year. Get the decisions out, then you see where you are with appeals, and then at that stage it might be the appropriate time to notify other variations. So it may not be that you've got a fully operative plan before you start doing plan changes, but certainly before you do any variations, ideally you wouldn't want to do that before you've issued your decisions, because then you've got a line in the sand and say, this is our decisions version of our plan, we know what's been appealed, what's not. And if any provisions that are not appealed, they then can become operative, so you can rely on those. Then you may choose to do a variation to change your zoning or something at that stage.
Because I assume that there is an appeals on every plan, that they don't all end up in the Environment Court, surely, or do they?
Can you think of any that haven't?
I think going into these processes, inevitable you have to assume some appeals. I can't think of any plans in the South Island, even small ones, that haven't had at least 2 or 3 appeals, just because of some of the issues that Louise said at the start. It's, you're dealing with the future rights and responsibilities of people's land, and anyone can submit, so it can be neighbours, and often through a process like this, you've got 250 submissions. Someone's going to be unhappy with the decision, and there'll be at least some appeals, you have to assume. And it doesn't mean that because council's got it wrong, it might be that a neighbour thinks, hey, I don't like that outcome, or I didn't get quite enough of what I wanted, or whatever. So, yeah, I think when you're dealing with people's resources and their future rights, it's inevitable that someone will want to have another go through the court. Yep. Okay, thank you. The only other thing I'd add to decisions is it's one of the responsibilities for the panel is to organise themselves and the way in which they reach their decisions as they see fit, is the statutory obligation, and we would probably be expecting that the panel with a work program like this on a whole plan will probably want to hear submissions on all of those chapters and hold back their decisions and then issue them in final on all those chapters at once would be normal practice, because then they get to look at interrelationships between the chapters to make sure they all align. Would probably be our expectation that the panel would want to do it in that manner. The alternative to that is that they issue decisions on each chapter or each topic as they go. And the obvious risk with that is as soon as a decision is issued, it is subject to appeal, as we've just talked about. And once you're faced with an appeal on a particular topic or chapter, that then has to be dealt with. And that can take many months depending on how many appellants and what the issues are to resolve. And it's quite challenging to move on to continue hearings on subsequent chapters and topics when you're dealing with an appeal at the same time on an earlier chapter. And the classic example you'll see in Megan's schedule is strategic directions is the first chapter. If the panel issued decisions on that and they were appealed by people going through the court process, that will probably imperil the work program, because it's really challenging then for the hearing panel to charge on and continue to make decisions in other hearings in light of appeals on, say, your strategic directions. So that's why I say it's probably normal practice for a program like this for the panel to hear the chapters in sequence. They might deliberate on their decisions but park them pending hearing the others to make sure they all align, and then issue them in one suite, and then all appeals run from that same date is probably what I'd expect the panel to do. So it's worth just thinking about that and being aware of that in terms of how you expect them to operate.
And certainly my experience is that panels will prepare their decisions as they go. They'll have them written just sitting over here, and then after each hearing they'll just check are there any integration issues they need to deal with, update those. And so what I would expect is, if we've got the panel running really well, you would actually get a decision reasonably quickly after the last hearing, because the key there is you don't want a big delay, because that's a downtime, so it's nice to get that out as quickly as possible. So hence the need to have really good support around the panel advisor will help that process and help drafting decisions if that's useful. So that's just getting back to the fact that if we can resource the panel well, we can resource the hearings well. You'll see the hearings run smoothly, you won't have the downtime, you'll save some serious money, and you'll get decisions out more quickly.
Okay. It's probably quite topical this week with the election coming up on Saturday, but we were asked to sort of address you on, well, what does all this mean if the government changes, or, you know, what's happening to the RMA? And this is an uncomfortable area for a lawyer to speak about, because it's entirely speculative. We like talking about this is what the law says and this is what you should do, but obviously there's an election on Saturday. I'm well aware that the National Party have said publicly that they will repeal the Natural and Built Environment Act by Christmas, and do what, we're not quite sure, other than possibly I've heard that they're talking about improving the RMA, which is what we currently operate under. So we shall see is probably what's going to happen there. But the real implication is that currently, even if the Natural and Built Environment Act, which is currently passed and is law, remains in effect as it currently is, it doesn't really affect the district plan program that you're working to, because it provides that the RMA stays in effect in this district until there's a whole new regional plan for Canterbury operative. And once that new regional plan for Canterbury is operative, then the RMA is effectively redundant, and the Natural and Built Environment Act in terms of plan making kicks in, and we're probably, according to MFE and all pundits, 8 or 10 years away from that date. So we think that there's still huge merit in this district still sorting out your district plan, getting it into a shape that you're happy with, going through the hearings, and by the end of next year have decisions made. Makes perfect sense to us, and shouldn't change, even if the government stays as it is and the current law stays as it is. If the government changes and National does what it says it will do and bins the new Natural Built Environment Act and retains the RMA, well, we probably are where we are today, and nothing changes either. So my current thinking is it's probably nothing to see here in terms of government and RMA change probably over the next year or two. Beyond that, it might be quite different in terms of a whole new regional planning framework. But I think it is still good advice, and it would still be my advice along the lines that it is money and effort well spent getting your district plan more current than the old one. You've notified it now, you're a long way down the track, you should hear submissions and carry on, get those resolved, and then what comes, you know, in 6 or 8 years, then at least you've got a current district plan that's reasonably fit for purpose, is probably still the best plan of attack. So that's some speculation there. Yeah.
The only other point just on that slide was that it's possible that some of the national guiding documents that are in place now, if we do see a change of government, they may look to change those or possibly even repeal those. That could impact on what we call the consentability of certain areas. And I guess what I'm thinking about is, for example, if you've got highly productive land that that there is some interest in changing to, say, residential or commercial. Currently, that would be very difficult to consent or get through a plan process under the National Environment Policy Statement for highly productive land. But we may see that is changed or repealed to make it a little bit easier. I wouldn't, you know, we don't know what they may do or may not, but that's just an example of something that might change even within the current legislative environment. But until they do that, we really don't know.
Could you just talk us through the legislative requirements now that we've published our proposed plan? So how long have we got to get it to its final state? And do we actually have a choice to do anything but? Like, you talk about these, you know, government changes and your advice is to still carry on, but do we even have a choice? Or under legislation, now that we've published it, can we choose to do something? I'm not saying we want to do something else, but could we even do that?
Yeah, it is actually a great question. So the RMA requires review of district plans every 10 years, which you've done and notified, which satisfies that. And having done that, then you have 2 years from that notification to make decisions on submissions, which I think you're running very tight on. Maybe, and if you can't hit that 2-year date, you need the Minister's approval to extend that time limit. Is probably what you're facing over the next probably year or so, to see how you run on that time frame and seek permission from the Minister to go a bit longer. The option of pulling stumps and flagging the review, yeah, that would probably put you in peril of not completing a review of your district plan. So yeah, you are really statutorily committed to the process now. Yep.
Would I be right, Michael, in saying that if the new legislation was repealed, then we'd be back to the need to do district plan reviews every 10 years, so we'd just have to keep going for it? In a way, the new legislation, by implication, assumes that there's going to be this whole new regional structure and a regional plan, so it's actually said that you don't need to carry on because it assumes that this new regional planning authority is going to pick it up. But if that's not there, then yeah, you're still, each district has to carry on getting theirs as up to date as possible. And just to add to the point about the 2 years, yeah, we will need, if we need an extension, to go to the Minister to sort of set out why we need an extension. We would have to look at, well, how long we would need, and we would also have to possibly engage some stakeholders as well around that, because there will be people who will probably want us to get on as quickly as possible, and there'll be others who are quite happy to let this thing draw out, really. So yeah, that will be an interesting space to be in. Just as a bit of a wrap-up, I think this has been alluded to, that we have a report going to Council around a tweak to the panel structure next week. So that's just something, I guess, to bear in mind. And I think earlier on today there was reference given to what may be needed, resource hungriness and all of that, through the long-term plan, that there will need to be some workings and further discussions on that, because obviously the further through you have to push the district plan to get it done, then there are cost implications of doing that. And I don't think we've really factored in appeals, did we, and variations and a few other nuances. So watch this space. And just finally, I think it's also worth bearing in mind, and I think it's been alluded to, in the sense that if you have variations on top of plans and then on top of the operative plan, that the consenting space that goes on each resource consent, you have to consider currently both plans. And as the proposed plan moves on through the process, and Michael might like to talk a bit further, we have to have regard at different phases. There's different weights given to the proposed plan versus the operative plan, and it's a bit of a messy area, but one that we have to navigate nonetheless.
I think all I'd add is probably the point I made earlier, that once you start varying a statutory document, it adds complexity, and that applies to everyone who uses plans and processes consents. And I do agree that when you're dealing with resource consents, if you've got the operative plan, a proposed plan with variations over the top, it does create a complex planning environment for people to navigate and to understand. If you can avoid that, that's great, but it's not a perfect world. So complexity is probably the key word that it adds.
On that point, and you talked about this in a previous meeting we've had, and you've pretty much alluded to this, but just so we're 100% clear, if we left a variation until after the plan process is finished, the timeline could effectively be the same, couldn't it? If we just do our hearings and our appeals as is, close that off, then do the variation, you could end up at the same point time-wise as if you tried to do that variation on the way.
Yes, I think that's perfectly reasonable. Some of the difficulty with predicting timeframes here is whether you get appeals on things. Once you get an appeal on a topic, it throws your timeframes out, because they can, with the best will in the world, you might sort out an appeal in 4 or 6 months with a tailwind, but it can be a year or more, and then there's rights of appeal to the High Court again. So I think when you're dealing with RMA timeframes, you can bank on everything going well, but often it doesn't, and once you throw appeals in, the timeframes can be messed up with. So yes, I think if you had no appeals on your district plan and then you did a plan change, it's probably much of a muchness if you were varying things along the way and adding complexity and then trying to get to the same end point. I think that is right, but I can absolutely see if you do a variation and then you're trying to make decisions and you get appeals on that, that's probably more complex than getting it sorted and then doing a clean plan change at the end. Yep.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think the other important point is you've got to be realistic as a council about what you can achieve with your resource that you have and your team that you have. And even large councils really struggle with district plan reviews and how to actually get this done and get through hearings and get decisions out. So one of the things about adding variations mid-process is it's just such a big distraction for the team, and I think the work I've been doing with the team is that already this is really challenging, and to add that in, I think you would put the whole process at risk, and you may find that actually your timeframes just completely blow out.
I have a few other questions that are kind of related to the LTP, but related to this too. I know this is a little bit unknown, but assuming the natural built environment carries on as it is, what effect does that have on council, and are there other work streams that we need to be thinking about in the next 3, 5, 10 years that are going to come up out of that new legislation? Because we talked about it at our last Environmental Services Committee and thought it would probably made more sense to wait till after the election, but there's a whole lot of new legislation that I don't think many of us sitting around the room, myself included, really have an idea of what it's going to mean for council going forward.
Yeah, I can perhaps start to try and answer that in the sense that So assuming the Natural Built Environment Act continues, one of the first key things is that it requires formation of a regional planning committee, which you as a council will need to sort out with your fellow councils in Canterbury. And that planning committee has a range of quite onerous and difficult jobs in front of it, creating and notifying a spatial plan within, I think, a year of something. Was it 2 years? I can't remember whether it's 1 year or 2 years, but developing a spatial plan for the region is task number one, which is no small task, and then creating a regional plan for the region, a single plan. So that in itself is a major planning work stream. So yes, I think after Christmas, once we know the lay of the land and whether the legislation is there, if the NBEA remains in play, then council does need to move to start forming that regional planning committee, and how we're going to do a spatial plan and who's working is really the first major task.
Thanks. Then I just probably have a few questions around capacity. So maybe for Hamish and Megan, is what capacity do we have, given that this is your number one focus, to carry on business as usual? Because obviously, just because you're doing this, you've still got consents coming in that need to be processed. So what do you need there? Is my question.
No, thank you. It's a good question. I mean, we have split the team into effectively two teams, so that there's a team doing consents and a team doing policy. I guess, as Louise has alluded to, there are some roles that we just don't have in place, which would be helpful, and some which we've really only just filled. So we've got a team at the moment with two senior planners. There's Megan, there's two senior planners, both of them are part-time and working remote. We have another resource management planner and a planning admin person. And beyond that, there's a whole lot of consultants who, including present company, but obviously those ones who are doing the Section 42A reports, and then you've got the actual panel itself. So we're still working through procurement with that panel and the Section 42A report authors. So that's a, individual by individual conversation, negotiation, discussion. I guess there are some other specialist skill sets that we may or may not need. It might be noise or I don't know, ecology or somebody like that to actually to bring in. And then it's the logistics of the hearings, getting everybody there in the right place and and working through with submitters their timings, when to come into the hearing, that side of things. So it's gathering momentum, but we are still a little bit behind, I'd have to say. And and recruitment is difficult at the moment, just generally.
On that note, is there anything maybe from Louise and Michael, what's the main thing that you haven't already covered that council and councillors can do to support the council officers to make sure this succeeds? Because obviously it's a major work stream and we don't want to derail it.
No, that's a great question, and I think hopefully the chat today's been a bit of a start around that. Is that frankly, to do this and do it well, it does need to be a priority for council. I guess from a council law perspective, what I would say is, this is your plan. You have notified this plan, and it's about owning it in the community and with staff. And yes, there'll be a process now where there are submissions and they'll be considered, and there may be some changes to the plan as a result of those. But the reality is this is your plan. So it would be just about, providing that support. If there's chit-chat in the community, I'd be just sort of saying, well, there's a process and we're following it, and it's all going well, thanks. So that would be my advice. as councillors, because the least noise you have outside, the easier it is for staff to get on and do their jobs and support them. So that would be the first thing. And then I guess just, adding to Hamish's points about that, there is still some gaps in resourcing. And of course, they are going to cost some money. So it would be about providing that budget allowance for both some in-house staff. But the reality is, with a plan process, you will need some specialists, and they are likely to need to be consultants. It's unlikely you'll be able to have those as in-house staff. So you are going to need to have some consultants on this, a mix of staff and consultants, which obviously is going to need some budget.
I think just also that applies not just to the planning team, because, I can say, well, we need this role or that role, but it's also, as Louisa said, across the board. So there will be, I guess, potentially directions come from the panel, and then other teams are pulled into action, which may affect what they're doing as well. So it is kind of like has a bit of a ricochet effect right across the organisation. So again, I guess in terms of priorities next year, you've got to have in the back of your mind the district plan and what may come out of that, and that at any moment, you may be faced with a decision, well, do you want this report now or maybe later? That's the harsh reality, I think.
Just go back, sorry Louise, to a question you made. I know I've asked this before, but the more I hear it, the more I get it. So there's 4 councillors in this room who weren't part of the council that put this plan out. So how do we align with, this is our plan, we support it?
Yeah, and look, you're not alone. That's really common for councils to be in that position. I'm also helping Mackenzie District at the moment doing their plan review, and they've got the same thing. So theirs is a bit different in that they're doing their plan review in stages, but certainly for, based on the election last year, they had almost a whole set of new councillors. There's a couple who stayed on. And so that's been a process about, having them come along on the journey. So I totally understand that situation, that if you've come in and you think, well, hold on, I wasn't part of the promulgation of that plan. But the reality is that this is council's plan, and there are probably a number of decisions that have happened prior to your time that you may, that happened prior to your time. So it's... I don't know what to say really, other than that's the situation we're in. And and there is, if there are specific issues with the plan that the councillors would like reconsidered, then that's entirely fine. You can do that later, as we've been talking about with the Mayor, around possibly a variation once the decision's out, or plan changes. So there's for all councils, you have an ongoing work stream for plan changes. You don't actually, sadly, get to a point where you say, right, our district plan's done, we don't need to look at it for 10 years. That's not reality. So there's certainly opportunity in the future to make changes to district plans. And so, that's fine. But the reality is you have a district plan that you've notified as council, and really councillors have almost no input past notification unless you're on the hearings panel and you're conflict-free. And that's just the statutory process that we're in.
The observation I would add to that, though, is that I think it is in your interest as governors to have a good, smooth, well-resourced process, so that the members of the community out there who have submitted and said, hey, your plan should change in accordance with my submission, that they get a timely hearing, it's well run, they get a decision, and they can understand what their rights are, and that might change the plan in a way that people have advocated for. So it is, I think, important that you support the statutory process and say, look, there's a process, put your submissions and your evidence to the panel, they'll consider that, and we've resourced the panel, there's a room available, go and make your submission there. That's the right place to make the submission. That's the statutory process. We support the panel doing its work, and out of that will come a decision. It might improve that person's rights or whatever. And then if they don't like that, they can appeal, and then that goes to the court to decide. So I think you can differentiate between the process, that you want a good, clean, tidy process where people can air their concerns, as opposed to saying I agree or disagree with this particular rule or policy which some other councillor has sort of put forward. Thank you.
My only comment is probably for Hamish is that, you know, coming into LTP, that your budgets are realistic, and I think we've heard that you're going to need some resource, so we're expecting to see that come through. The other interesting point I'll note, I mean, we're aiming at, you know, potentially finishing around July 25. You know, if it goes any longer than that, we're almost in another election. It could be another cycle of council who get to sign off on it. So the process, you know, can go through many iterations of council. One of the things that you emphasised, and I just thought we might touch on this, is that our role, you know, once we hand it off to the panel, at the end is very much rubber stamp. So it's not for the opportunity at that 11th hour to come in and say, I don't like that part, I want to change it, I want to change that, I want to change that. And there's risk, obviously, if people are wanting to do that at that point in time. So I just think it's important that we emphasise that for councillors, so they don't come in thinking later on that they're going to make further changes. Yeah.
I just have one more question that is quite hypothetical, to be honest. I'm not even sure it's an issue here, but just in regards to conflicts of interest, and we've talked about it with councillors and panel members and things like that, what about with council staff or consultants that we're using, and if they were previously engaged in writing the district plan, does that cause a problem, or is that okay?
Yes, conflicts of interest go all ways and apply to everybody, not just councillors. So one of the things that the panel will likely direct is that expert witnesses who present evidence to the panel, and an expert is someone who provides opinion evidence, like planners, landscape experts and the like, are obliged to do so in accordance with a code of conduct, which identifies that, you know, they don't have conflicts, they haven't been previously involved, and they declare any interests that they've had in the process. So that's an important safeguard. So it is very important for experts to comply with that code. Other people, submitters, are advocates. They can advocate whatever it is they see that changes that they want, so it doesn't really apply to them in terms of conflicts. Yeah, so that's what I'd say.
Yeah, just to add to that, Mike, and I think perhaps your question was around perhaps that the experts that council appoint to assist in the advice to the panel. Is that what you were thinking?
Both that, and you talked about some other reports that need to be written, yeah.
Yeah, so that's a really good point, and it's just a matter of professionalism, really. So as a professional planner, I have obligations all the time to meet the expert witness code of conduct. So any consultants, for example, that council might commission to assist them with 42A reports, recommendation reports, those people need to have the expertise, they need to be free of conflict. So that's just a process, but that should apply with everything you do anyway as a council. So, but yeah, you may find that there are some people who are conflicted and not able to assist in certain topics, and they should be very clear with staff about that. Yeah.
Yeah, but I would add, in terms of the specific question about staff or planners who have been involved in preparing the plan, that in itself isn't necessarily a conflict. Staff can help work up a plan and assist council to notify it, but they are obliged to then consider submissions and other evidence properly and with, you know, due consideration. So they can't just say, well, I helped write a chapter and it's perfect and I'll never change it. It's irresponsible and wouldn't be in accordance with the code. So they would need to consider submissions and other evidence and look at that fairly. Yeah, and the panel can ask them about that. Yep. All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I thought it was a great presentation. Sorry, not you were going to say that. Yeah, no, that was really good, and I think it's good for all of us to hear that. And we'll be encouraging councillors that aren't here to watch it since it's recorded.